So good afternoon. I'm David Smith from the Forage Center for Peace Building and Humanitarian Education, and I am pleased today to introduce our ninth Forage Center conversation. In 2020, we started hosting Forage Center conversations as a virtual opportunity to talk about issues that related to humanitarian work, emergency management, dealing with refugees, internally displaced people, kind of a broad discussion of issues that impact all of our work. During the pandemic, we were holding many Forage Center conversations because it wasn't much that we could do beyond that. Last October, we went back to live programming with a program at Arcadia University. And then this past June, we did a program at our site in Western Maryland with students from George Mason, American, and the University of Massachusetts. But we still want to maintain having Forage Center conversations. So this is the first one we've had since the middle of 2021. So we are glad today to have one. So I'm going to introduce Jess Bonham-White, who's the Director of Education, and then she'll introduce Dr. Maritza Jauregui. Both are faculty members from Stockton University. Today's topic is on sustainability and disaster response, understanding the progression of vulnerability. And Jess, besides being a professor at Stockton University, is the Director of Education at the Forage Center. So I'll turn it over to Jess. I'll be here throughout in case anybody needs me, and I will be letting people in as they arrive. So Jess, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, David. So yes, my name is Jess Bonham-White. Some of you may recognize me, but that's great. So I am a faculty member at Stockton University in Galloway, New Jersey. I teach criminal justice and emergency management and homeland security. I'm also the program coordinator of our migration studies minor, and I am the volunteer, a director of education and training for the Forage Center, and I'm very proud of the curricula that we put on. And one of the reasons why we have these conversations is that we want our professionals and practitioners and students who are thinking about emergency management and humanitarian education to really think about some of the topics and issues that may be tangential to the response every day, or recovery or preparedness or things like that, so that as you walk into your professions or as you're thinking about your own professional development and areas to learn about, that we're bringing some of those ideas to you so that we can spark some creativity. Dr. Jauregui is one of my esteemed colleagues at Stockton University. She's an associate professor of sustainability. I'll let her talk a little bit more about her research, but we're going to, one of the things that a lot of those in the humanitarian world, the emergency management world, are talking about are the impact of our actions. And I think for some of us, because we think about humanitarian crises and disaster response and things like this, there is a thought to what our impact is socially, but sometimes we need to think about it in our physical environments, in the material environments, what it means short-term, what it means midterm, what it means long-term. And I know that there's a lot of discussion about climate change and that environmental impact. But literally, if you think about some of what we do, we really do alter the environments of where we end up doing our response from. So I wanted Dr. Jauregui to come and really talk about this from a sustainability aspect. So we're going to go for about a half hour or so. Then we're going to open it up for conversations, for questions. Anyone, I am watching the chat, so I'll make sure to watch for questions. But this is really an informal way of talking about some really important issues that relate to our practice of emergency management, humanitarian assistance, homeland security. So with that, I will put it over to you.
Thank you so much. I thought I should give a little bit more about my background before I started to talk about the issues today. So my background is actually Pretty varied. I have an undergraduate degree in sociology and geology, and my PhD is in social ecology with an emphasis in environmental health, science, and policy. So I was trained in both the social sciences and the natural sciences. And what I really saw was a real disconnect in the way in which environmental health issues, particularly disasters, were viewed in these broad fields. So for example, in the social science literature, particularly in the psychological literature, you had very much a focus on individual resilience. And in the natural and applied sciences, the focus was usually on what really amounted to engineering projects on different scales, right? And so that's why I was drawn to the field of sustainability, because it really considers and it focuses on those interrelationships among the two, on issues of social and environmental disparities. And it takes into account the realities, right? The realities of the physical environment, the realities of the social environment. Okay, so some of my research focuses on the disconnect, even in the way in which we measure vulnerability and resilience in communities and the instruments that we use. Everybody has their own instrument that was created for a particular purpose, for a particular situation. Each federal agency and state agency uses their own indices, and they vary greatly in the way in which vulnerability and resilience are defined and the types of information that's considered. So what I'm trying to do is reapply these measures to similar data sets across the spectrum in order to find out which serve as the best predictors of long-term outcomes at various stages of complex emergencies. And a second line of interest of mine is the role of environmental and social disparities in this process. So that's just a little bit about me, why I'm interested in these things. And really my focus is always looking at what the connections are, where things overlap, and where we should be looking to try to solve the problems that we have. So I was just going to give a little background on sustainability and issues pertaining to sustainability around disasters. So let me just share my screen.
Wonderful. You're already speaking the language that got me so excited to invite you. So wonderful.
Well, thank you. If you have any questions along the way, please, speak up, ask questions. We're here to help anyway. I'm here to help any way I can. So let me just share this screen. So is that viewable to everyone?
Yep, see it. Yep. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. All right. So I thought that it was best to probably begin with a general definition of sustainability. And the reason that I wanted to do this is because many people still tend to think of sustainability as just environmental sustainability. And really, most people see it as an extension of environmental science that just focuses on using fewer resources so we don't run out. And sustainability is really not an extension of environmental science. Sustainability is really about meeting human needs now and in the future. And that's something that those of you who deal with complex emergencies know quite a bit about, right? So, when you look at this definition, it implies that the environment goes beyond physicality, that it also includes the social and the political circumstances under which these populations find themselves. And that, we should be doing things that help to ameliorate our common situation. We need to understand these linkages in order to truly make a difference versus just putting a Band-Aid on the situation. So sorry about that. I'm just trying to make sure that everything's working. So it's about being able to meet human needs now and in the future with the understanding that the environment and its resources should dictate how we do this. right? So the issues of justice, economics, social structure, nature, human rights, and even the fate of the planet are really all interconnected. It means that we have to accept the fact that society is reliant on the environment in which it exists, and that the economy and everything that it entails is dependent upon the decisions that we make as a society and on the environmental resources that we have and don't have as populations. Okay, so that means when we're looking at sustainability, when we're considering sustainability, we're really looking at three different elements. Okay, we're looking at elements that encompass everything from the environment to society to the economy. So maintaining the Earth's life support system, considering things like ecosystem services such as pollution filtering, right? Or buffering from extreme weather events. We have to consider things like maintaining community capacity that fosters effective participation, and things like equitable treatment of all community members. And we also have to consider things like maintaining an economic system that's going to provide a non-declining standard of living for not just this generation, but future generations as well. So, when we consider these things and we're talking about the environment, it's not just about overuse of our resources. It considers things like biodiversity and material and energy, and even the interactions among these. When we're talking about the economy, we're talking about employment opportunities as well as market forces. And when we're talking about the social aspects, we're not just talking about quality of life or even institutional structures. We're also talking about building diversity through maintaining, building resilience through maintaining diversity. Right? Because our most resilient systems are actually our most diverse systems. So that's why when we consider things like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we aren't just considering issues like, life below water or climate action. We're also considering things like gender equality and peace and justice. Okay? All of these things are interrelated. And so today what I wanted to focus on was really on the elements of sustainability and disasters that are related to environmental justice, to environmental equity, and so for those of you who aren't familiar with the idea of environmental justice is the right to a safe, healthy, productive, and sustainable environment for all. And when we talk about the environment, we're really talking about all of the environment. So that means biological, physical, social, political, aesthetic, and economic environments, okay? Not just the natural and built environment. Okay, so the goal of environmental justice is really to ensure that all people, regardless of their backgrounds, regardless of race, national origin, and income, are protected from disproportionate impacts of environmental hazards. Okay. So when we see communities that are suffering from environmental injustice, that are bearing a disproportionate amount of environmental harm, what we're really seeing is communities that are lacking capacity, that are usually already lacking the very structure that humanitarian crises destroy, right? That are part of humanitarian crises. Oftentimes, the groups that have been impacted the most during the humanitarian crisis is actually the group that has been chronically impacted all along, right? That it's not a one-time event. Okay. So, sorry, let me just see if I can, is that showing? Is this part showing? It is, isn't it? Is there a way of actually reducing that you know, or no? That's okay if it isn't, don't worry.
Yeah, so we're seeing a slide that defines vulnerability. Is that what you're?
It is. It is. I just wanted to make sure that it wasn't showing the share. Nope,
Nope.
the
it's
share
just-
bar. Okay. I just wanted to make sure because sometimes I click on things and they just show up on the screen. So, all right. So, we're talking about vulnerable communities, but these are vulnerable communities that have been created over time, right? They're not just vulnerable at the point of disaster. And this is something that we have to consider in terms of emergency management, right? This is something that we need to think about in terms of the reality of these populations and the fact that some populations have been impacted all along and are in a much more vulnerable place. So let me just. There we go. So, a disaster is really just the serious disruption of the functioning of society, right? Something that causes widespread losses and which the community can't cope with using only its own resources. And so when we're considering this, oftentimes we tend to focus on these stages here. We understand that they feed into each other. We understand that it's an iterative process. But sometimes we get too caught up in this model without going back to the basics, which is the fact that that community didn't have the ability to cope using its own resources, right? That's the essential part of vulnerability, right? So, disasters don't just happen. You need a vulnerable community to come in contact with a hazard, right? This is the traditional way, the traditional equation for a disaster, right? We have a hazard that comes in contact with a vulnerable community, and that results in a disaster. But disasters aren't really freak accidents. They're not horrible things that just happen to communities. We're the ones that actually create the disasters. We, meaning we as a whole, right? The same way that we create communities who bear unequal burdens of environmental harms, and the same way that we can create healthy communities. So a lot of times there's confusion over a hazard and a disaster. And I'm sure those of you in the audience are familiar with this, but I just wanted to make sure that everybody was on the same page. A hazard can be natural or man-made, but it's something that has the potential to adversely affect a population in terms of human life or its activity or property. It's not the disaster itself. The disaster itself only occurs when that hazard comes in contact with that population. So, there's another associated issue, and that's of environmental equity. So when we're talking about environmental equity, we're actually considering things like cumulative exposure and social vulnerability. In fact, those are the two elements of environmental equity. And so we're talking about the accumulation of environmental disamenities in certain communities. And then we're also talking about the capability of communities to weather these hazards, right? Can they actually withstand these hazards? But the reality is that these are interrelated and they feed off of each other. They exist in a feedback loop. So where you see communities that have cumulative exposure to environmental harms, you also see an increase in social vulnerability. And when you see an increase in social vulnerability, that usually leads to more cumulative exposure. And this definitely feeds into making this community a vulnerable one and putting it in the position of ending up in a disaster, ending up in a crisis. So this is what's called the pressure model. It's actually also called the progression of vulnerability model. It's been around for a very long time. It's also sometimes called the pressure and release model. Okay. So it helps us to explain how a community might become vulnerable in order for a disaster to occur. So when we're looking at this, what we're considering are the basics in terms of what's causing this vulnerability. So population that's living in poverty, or population that has limited access to power structures, where they don't have political connections, no one hears what they have to say, no one cares what they have to say, even when they do speak up. Also tends to be a community that has limited access to financial capital, to knowledge, to skill sets that help them to survive. When you think about a disaster in terms of emergency management, we tend to treat everyone equally, more or less, right? And the reality is that they're not equal. There are environmental inequities that have been taking place throughout this, right? You have to think about who had access to maybe fleeing the location beforehand. Who has the money, who has the transportation, who has the information, who knows what forms to fill out. Something else to consider when we talk about root causes is ideologies and belief systems in place, right? These belief systems are perpetuated through structural inequalities and institutional discrimination of various types, right? It determines who gets an education, what type of job they have, how much money or wealth they have. And there are certain groups that over time have gotten to the situation where they don't have any of this because of underlying belief systems that believe that their group doesn't deserve this. Economic systems, right? What kind of economic system is in place and who gets paid how much for doing what? Is there a large inequity in wealth? Are there fail-safes in place to make sure that population still meet their needs after their immediate needs are being met during that disaster, right? What about the long term? These root causes that feed into the vulnerability continue even after the immediate needs have been met during disaster management or emergency management. When we talk about dynamic pressures, these underlying causes, these root causes, lead to these local dynamic pressures, which combine with macro or large scale pressures. So for example, you have local conditions, like a lack of local institutions like hospitals, clinics, emergency response teams, poor local schools, few resources, a disinvestment in public services and goods, a local lack of support for local small businesses. All of this is going to impact what happens to this population during a disaster. And then these combined with those larger scale pressures like population growth due to migration of people that are there because of external conflict, because of economic situations, because of climate change, right? There are also macro level forces that determine things like the level of deforestation, the level of debt. Okay. that determine how much urbanization you see in a place. The more densely populated a location is, the more people are under risk. And the more likely you are to have different pockets of vulnerable populations in that area, right? Who have been bearing different types of cumulative burdens. Okay. So, when we're talking about environmental degradation, it makes the environment itself less stable and more likely to produce hazards like extreme weather events or emerging diseases. But you have these dynamic pressures that are forcing you to degrade the environment. And sometimes some of the things that we put in place to ameliorate the suffering that we see during these emergencies can actually result in the worsening of these situations over time. So what you end up with are unsafe conditions, such as a fragile physical environment. So people living in locations that are essentially dangerous, substandard buildings and infrastructure. And you usually have a combination of this with a fragile local economy, right? You have a likelihood of livelihoods that can never be retained during this type of situation. So you have populations that live paycheck to paycheck, basically, that have little or no savings, where no one has a job after the hazard hits. And so, whenever there's a disaster, people often ask, why were the people in harm's way? Could this have been prevented? Yes, it could have been prevented, but we have to understand what led to it. And these answers usually have to do with issues like environmental justice. And we see issues of environmental injustice occurring before a disaster, during the disaster, and afterwards. And it causes differential in terms of who ends up suffering the most in a humanitarian crisis and who's impacted to begin with. And sometimes we even see it precipitate the crisis itself. So let me go on, because I know that we are running out of time. I'm just going to skip over a few things I was going to say, because I feel like they'll probably come up in questions. So what can we do? Our efforts to reduce vulnerability, traditionally, even in emergency management, usually only occur after major events have occurred. We either see them in our own communities, other communities, and then we take note and try to do something about it. But in order to really have long-term solutions, there's certain things that we should be doing. Yes, we need to deal with underlying causes, especially underlying causes that contribute to environmental inequities. We need to increase capacity at all stages. So understanding that social networks have helped to build resilience. We have to ask ourselves, how can we help to maintain and encourage those networks at all stages of a disaster? Studies have shown that populations that are able to maintain those social networks throughout all the different phases of disaster fare better in terms of their long-term health and their resilience than those that are unable to do so. Also, those that have greater input during the mitigation stage, in planning, and basically in all phases of disaster, the most sustainable and equitable plans are those to which everyone has agreed to ahead of time. And this requires other changes in terms of our thinking, right? First of all, we need to understand the systems that are in place, right? We need to understand what constraints we're operating under, and can't assume that what worked well in one environment will work well in another, because our social environments, our built environments, and even our natural environments are very fragile, and can be impacted in much greater ways than we expect. The other thing is to focus on systems thinking, right? When we fail to see the interconnectedness of the problems that are faced by these populations, we actually open ourselves up to creating more long-term problems when we're offering immediate aid, as I mentioned. Offering immediate aid is complex enough, right? But we have to consider that immediate solutions that reduce the strength of the problem usually work well at first, but tend to fail in the long run because of unexpected outcomes that can sometimes amplify the problem, or more likely amplify another problem that at the surface seems unrelated. And trust me, they're related. They are related. And so we have to use things like second level thinking, which consists of laying down second order and third order consequences, thinking about these, taking into account our own biases, our own assumptions about what's going to happen and what's best for a population. There are issues with that. A lot of people struggle with systems thinking. For a lot of people, it doesn't come naturally. And that's because we tend to be trained in a scientific reductionistic way, right? We're trained to compartmentalize. I mean, look at our educations. We study every single subject separately. No one ever points out those connections. We're taught this. If we break down an organism into smaller and smaller parts, we'll understand the organism. But really, I mean, how many of you have actually understood your best friend better by understanding your friend's genes? Like it just doesn't happen, right? You hand up a liver or a heart or something, their genetic structure. What does that tell you about your best friend? And it's the same thing, we have to look at the whole. When we're seeing a problem, when we're seeing an event, we're seeing a hazard contact, a vulnerable community, what we're seeing are problems that are part of an overall system. Okay. And we have to see that system in the context of relationships to come up with sustainable solutions. Okay. Oops, sorry about that. Let me just stop my share for a second so I could get back to what I was going to show. But actually, I think we're almost out of time, so I can.
This actually, yeah, this may be a place to pause and kind of ask questions and see if, because there's already one in the chat. I've got several pages of notes myself, so there's probably some things to talk about. And as I was watching, I kept thinking, oh, you're hitting all the concepts I hit in class. So that was very exciting. And in also the exercises that we designed for the Forage Center, right? Like a lot of what you're talking about, particularly some of those social aspects, we integrate into our exercise, a curriculum, and some of the scenarios that we build. So this is really exciting because it sort of makes us think about, how do we prepare our future practitioners in all of these related fields to really be thinking about the systems thinking. When you're right, we aren't, for a variety of reasons that, some of my questions are about, we really aren't taught to systems think, right?
Right.
And in fact, even thinking systematically sometimes is met with resistance because it means you're doing something else. So, but I'm going to put Will, who is one of our staff members at the Forage Center. They ask, in thinking about how to create a proactive versus a predominantly reactive response, great. That's a contrast that we see all the time. What can communities do on the micro, the meso, or the macro levels to create ways to counteract vulnerability? So maybe, a chat a little about different level actions.
Right. So that's a really good question. I'll start with the macro level, right? On the macro level, when we are planning, oh, it depends. We have to be considerate of how the issues that we deal with in that community are interrelated, right? We need to see the overlap. We need to take into account the capacity that we have. So if we're splitting up our resources, if we're splitting them up and everybody's taking their favorite passion and following that to try to improve the quality of life of the community, what we end up doing is duplicating efforts, and we also end up sometimes having efforts that work against each other, right? So one of the practices that does tend to work is multi-solving. So looking at those problems that we see in our community, understanding what the trigger points are, where those root causes overlap, and then pooling our resources to work towards ameliorating those root causes, right? Taking a step back. Everybody has their passion, everybody has their favorite cause that they want to work towards. And that's wonderful, but we also need different perspectives to work together to understand the commonalities in order to come up with solutions that are going to work for the long term. On a meso level, again, the capacity building, making sure that we maintain social networks, for instance, that we take into account environmental degradation and environmental burdens in particular communities. And this is really place-based. So a geographic mapping of hazards and understanding which communities are likely to be most vulnerable and why, so that we can better plan for it. It's not just an issue of justice and justice activism. It's an issue of practicality and understanding how those cumulative burdens, especially those cumulative environmental burdens, have already impacted a community and have also impacted what's going to happen next. Right.
And micro level, what, just one idea, like how do individuals start this or impact this? Or because we're talking to individuals who are individual practitioners, right? We all.
Right. So on the micro level, we can try to convince our colleagues that we should be embedding more of this into our practices, right? Because the way in which we deal with disasters has changed over time, and it's improved. It really has improved, and programs and centers like this have done a lot of work towards that. But there's still a lot of change that needs to be made, right?
Great.
There's still a lot of people who tend to think in terms of, this is my expertise, this is what I do, and this is the way we've always done it, and this works, right? Yes, but what you have to point out is, yes, this works for the short term. It doesn't really work for the long term in terms of solving the root causes. It's going to keep happening again and again and again.
Yeah. And I would also argue, how are you measuring it works, right? Did it work for everyone? Did it work for those in power? Which may then transfer over to David's question here. David, would you like to read it aloud since you posted it in the chat?
Well, at the end of the day, it's about political will, isn't it? I mean, that's really a tough nut to crack, but what are some strategies in creating the political will that people would look at? Because it comes to policy, right? Individual groups can do individual things, but if the policymakers aren't there, how do we get them there?
Or then even if I could just add, the political will, when so much is seen as as automatic. I mean, you've said words like activism, justice, things
Yeah.
automatically written off as divisive, things like that. How do we build an understanding that these are just processes that if you ignore them, we know what the consequences are. So how do we rebuild that political will to be more inclusive of that?
Right. I think that some of it has to do with individuals from different fields just communicating with each other, right? Being open to communication, not preaching to the choir, right? Which we're all guilty of, especially in academia. But even outside of academia, I've seen this, right? Groups again and again complaining that this other group just doesn't understand. Well, this other group just doesn't understand because they don't understand your language. They're too far removed from your understanding to come to an agreement or to see where things overlap. A lot of time, there's another perspective that says we should actually just be looking at the policies that are in place and see where those policies can work in conjunction with each other, right? Take advantage of the policies that are already there and use them to your advantage in terms of creating change, right? That's a different perspective. The first perspective says, well, you know, there's just not enough discourse among individuals from different fields, different professions, different political perspectives. And then the others say, well, you know, it's too hard to change things one policy at a time. Really, what we should be doing is seeing what we already have in place and how it could be better utilized.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Sometimes it's something as simple as changing the way in which we communicate, right? Not using words that are seen as divisive, not using words that are trigger words for individuals that you're speaking to, explaining yourself rather than just using jargon. Because when you use jargon, others tend to misunderstand. They tend to assume, like we all assume, right? We think we know what it means. We've been exposed to the term, but it's not necessarily the same as what somebody else is, how someone else is using it.
Right. Going back to vulnerability, you know, I really appreciate how you emphasize that there's environmental vulnerability, there's social vulnerability, there's economic vulnerability, and these sorts of things. In your own work trying to communicate this, what successes have you had, or what sort of in what ways have you been able to sort of talk about those areas to make potentially people go, oh, right, you know, now you're talking in my language, right? So if I was going to go to my local town council and say, you know, and talk about this, what successes have you had, or ideas would you have to be able to get over potentially some of that resistance?
Okay. So part of it is understanding their needs, understanding what they're most concerned with, and trying to address those needs through what you have to offer, right? So they may have no interest at all in these issues until you show them that this was a potential solution to something that they see as a problem. And that usually tends to be the most successful approach, making sure that you're putting their needs first versus you wanting to communicate something to them. Oftentimes we tend to come from our own perspective and say, well, we know a lot about this. Let's push my information on you. And that's where you deal with the most resistance, or they just don't care, like they're like, that's very nice. They'll just.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you make, that, and you're exactly right. In academia, we are very guilty of this, right? We have these sets of data and we say, here's what you don't know, or here's what you don't understand, or here's, if I just push this a little further, if I just told you about this study, and this study, and sometimes the sort of understanding even what different organizational missions are, things like that. So if you go to an organization, so we're a humanitarian organization, there's other humanitarian organizations, we tend to think that everyone is thinking in a humanitarian way when maybe that might not be the mission. And so it's how to build the skill of starting with asking, well, what are your concerns, right? That's an interesting way of thinking about it. I just see Jillian asked a question. So there are many who are going to be watching this. You and I mean, all of us here are educators in some way, or have been educated at some point. How can we get students involved earlier in these ideas so that they bring their experience in dealing with this into their practice world when they graduate?
Well, I think that part of it is letting them participate in things like community science projects, data collection on a community level in their own communities. So they build that network within the community. They get experience as practitioners who then see what the actual issues are. And then they carry that on later. Using that community science model has actually been quite successful in the past in terms of getting people involved, whether they're students or not, at raising awareness, getting people to talk to each other, and then helping people see things from a different perspective, especially when you're talking about things like cumulative environmental burdens.
Yeah. What about, so we're here in Southern New Jersey, although David is sitting in Maryland, right? And others around. How do we communicate? I think one of the challenges within the United States, right, is that we even think about some of these things different. We talked about emergency management, where much of the rest of the world talks about a disaster risk reduction. They're much more tied into the developmental goals that you showed earlier. There's a different way of thinking about how emergency management fits into other activities that here in the United States is a little bit unique. Maybe other places, but certainly here, where there's almost like a, it's not part of the humanitarian world, or I mean, you'll hear the words, but it isn't quite practiced the same. But also part of what's interesting is, we are very big. We are 50 states and territories, right? Look at what's happening in Puerto Rico right now. How do we get such a dispersed and diverse population who may not even know all of the places in the United, like we know what the Jersey Shore is. I've never been to the California shore. Like I've never seen a beach in California, one day maybe, right? How can we get Americans in particular to be thinking about their wide range of vulnerabilities of others who sort of are in their larger national community, again, in the hopes of getting them to think globally. But how do we even begin with such a diverse and decentralized system that we have in this country?
Right. I think that's a function of the political system that we have, right? Making, each state is part of the United States, but separate. And it very much shows in terms of the way in which we approach public health issues. And emergency management is very much seen as part of public health. And we tend to think of public health as an afterthought, despite the fact that most of the advances we've made in life expectancy in this country have been due to public health initiatives. We tend to disregard public health. We tend to disregard anything dealing with it. As long as things are going smoothly, we don't want to think about it. And so that's a really difficult question to answer. I'm afraid I really don't have the answer to that.
wish you-
simply because, I wish I did. I absolutely wish I did, but I really don't. I really don't know. Is my answer, because I wish.
Yeah. So working off of that, just for a minute, because we are still sitting in 2022, and sometimes our students ask this, what have we learned from COVID that can be applied to this? Or what haven't we learned potentially?
Right. At the beginning, I was actually thinking, oh, there's so much that we're learning right now from COVID. This will be fantastic. It's really raising awareness about these disparities, these vulnerabilities, about these underlying structures. Everybody's going to see these connections and everything's going to change. No. I really wish that I could say that I've seen true change. But we haven't. What we have learned is the places in which we're weak in terms of managing crises and managing emergencies at a federal level. But I haven't really seen any real change in the number of resources that have gone towards this, the types of training on a broader level. So we have learned a lot academically, but in terms of practical implementation, I haven't even seen resources being placed where they should be. Okay.
So as we finish up here, and I'm
I'm sorry. I wish I should have had something a little more uplifting for us.
It's a very similar answer that I have often. And so my last question actually goes a bit with what Jillian talks about, giving students an emergency that they get involved with and have to research the resources and things like that. If you were designing, and I say this very selfishly because I'm part of the designing of humanitarian exercises that we then send students and practitioners through to practice this, what's the one thing you would want us to add and say, if this is in your exercise, or as we're doing this as classroom activities or something like this, ask this question or ask this thing or do this. What's the one thing that maybe we can add or make sure that we have in to address, at least starting some of what you've presented?
Right. Well, there are two ways of approaching it. One of them is, like I said earlier, in these exercises, make sure that the students are working within their own communities. Not use hypotheticals, but actually using the exercise to help raise awareness about what's going on in their own communities, and helping them in terms of participating in community asset mapping, citizen science projects, incorporating those types of things in there. But the other thing is sort of practicing systems thinking and multi-solving, using tools as simple as an iceberg diagram. Are you familiar with the iceberg diagram?
Yeah, but go ahead and explain for the recording.
Oh, okay. All right. So an iceberg diagram is a really simple tool that's used to better understand the systems that are in place that are contributing to a particular event that we're witnessing. So at the very top of this iceberg diagram is this event, right? This disaster that has occurred. But underneath, directly underneath that, are these trends that are occurring. There are various trends that are constantly under the surface, and this one event is really just one data point on those trends.
Mm-hmm.
And on the surface, those trends look like they're unrelated, right? There are certain trends in this community. Everybody, like I said, depending upon their field, picks one trend to focus on. But if you go one layer under that, then what you can see are the system structures that show how these trends are interrelated. And I think that just understanding those structures is extremely helpful when trying to figure out what the repercussions would be of what the impacts would be of our practices. You know, you always have cascading consequences within systems. And so understanding what will be impacted and in what way. And then in that iceberg model, there's one last layer all the way at the bottom, which is our mental models. So basically, what assumptions are we making? What are our beliefs that help to create this structure in the first place, that created, you know, this connection of trends that we're seeing, of you know, individual events that all link together.
Well, that's great. It's a great way, I think, to close us out. Does anyone else have any last questions? Anything they'd like to ask? David, did you want to say anything else to close us out?
No, I thank you very much, Maritza. I'll let you close it out, Jess.
Great. So thank you very much. This has been very interesting to listen to. I think particularly now, really thinking about systems thinking and the whole, maybe that is the one lesson I would say sort of that should hopefully come out of a COVID, is that there's a need to just how do we communicate that, and how do we continue that. And so for anyone watching, you know, if you're interested in, you know, both David and I talked about exercises and scenarios and things like this, you can Google the Forage Center. You'll see our website and you'll see the programs that we do put on. We will continue with these Forage Center conversations. I think it's always helpful to talk with our experts and say, you know, what are we missing, or how do we make our curriculum? How do we make our practice even more holistic, which is sort of what we're trying to get at. So with that, I thank everyone for coming, and stay tuned. We have a YouTube channel, and stay tuned for our next conversation, and follow us on LinkedIn and Facebook and all the socials. So with that, thank you very much.
And thank you for having me. Thank you, everybody.
Great.